The sun beat down on the gilded terrace with a relentless, unforgiving heat that seemed to shimmer off the perfectly manicured lawns and the pristine white marble of the estates. Marcus Thorne wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand, his breath coming in steady, rhythmic cycles as he hoisted a heavy bag of premium mulch onto his shoulder. His hoodie, once a sharp black but now faded to a dusty charcoal, was damp with effort, and his work pants bore the dark, jagged stains of wet earth and machine grease. To anyone passing by, he was just another laborer, a nameless fixture of the landscape designed to keep the neighborhood looking like a dream while he existed in the periphery. But Marcus didn't mind the invisibility. There was a quiet, meditative dignity in the work. A way to honor a promise he had made to a friend who was no longer there to see the flowers bloom. High above him, perched on a limestone balcony that looked more like a throne than a piece of architecture, Eleanor Sterling adjusted her sunglasses with a manicured finger. She didn't see a man working, she saw a smudge on her horizon. Her eyes, sharp and cold like chips of ice, tracked Marcus's every move with a practiced suspicion that bordered on the obsessive. As the president of the WA, Eleanor considered herself the high priestess of the Gilded Terrace's aesthetic purity. She took a long, condescending sip of her iced tea, her lip curling in a sneer as she watched Marcus move toward his beat-up, rusted truck. The vehicle was an eyesore, a mechanical intrusion into her world of German engineering and silent electric motors. She checked her wrist to see if it was time for her lunch at the club, but her breath hitched. Her wrist was bare. The $50,000 diamond-encrusted watch, a custom piece that she flaunted like a badge of office, was gone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with an immediate, predatory focus. She looked at the side table where she was certain she had left it just moments ago. Empty. She looked back down at the driveway. There he was, the man in the faded hoodie. The outsider. The threat. Eleanor didn't just walk down her marble steps. She descended them like a storm front, her high heels clicking against the stone with the aggression of a firing squad. Marcus was just reaching for a shovel in the back of his truck when the screeching voice hit him like a physical blow. She didn't call for his attention, she demanded his soul. She screamed at him to stay exactly where he was, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, entitled fury that caused a neighbor's dog to begin barking frantically. Marcus turned slowly, his expression a mask of calm that only seemed to infuriate her further. He didn't drop his head or shuffle his feet. He simply stood there, a tall, solid presence against her frantic energy. Eleanor was inches from his face now, the scent of her expensive, cloying perfume clashing with the honest smell of rain-soaked earth on his clothes. She pointed a trembling, French manicured finger directly at his chest, accusing him of being a common thief before he could even utter a greeting. She told him she knew his type, that she had seen him eyeing her property from the moment he pulled his junk pile of a truck into her sightline. "Empty your pockets," she barked, her eyes bulging with the sheer arrogance of a woman who had never been told no. Marcus didn't move, he didn't reach for his pockets, and he didn't offer an apology for a crime he hadn't committed. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes steady and unblinking, seeing right through the facade of her wealth to the hollow, rotting prejudice beneath. This silence was the ultimate insult to Eleanor. She began to scream for the police, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone, claiming she was being threatened on her own land. From behind the heavy velvet curtains of the house next door, Mrs. Gable watched the scene unfold with a trembling hand over her mouth. She saw the rage in Eleanor and the quiet strength in Marcus, and she clutched a secret to her chest that felt heavier than any stone. The tension in the driveway was no longer just a misunderstanding, it was a spark in a powder keg, and the storm that had been brewing over the gilded terrace was finally about to break. The golden sunlight filtering through the oak trees of the gilded terrace seemed to blur, the sounds of Eleanor's screeching fading into a dull hum as Marcus's mind drifted back 15 years. The world was different then, colder and more clinical. He remembered the crisp, heavy weight of his graduation gown and the way the Ivy League air felt on his face, full of promise and the scent of old books and prestige. He had been the star, the brilliant architectural mind that professors whispered about in hushed, reverent tones. He had walked those hallowed halls with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm, his hands clean, his future a straight line toward the stars. But he also remembered the day that line snapped. He could still see the face of his mentor, a man he had trusted like a second father, trembling as the federal investigators moved in. Marcus had a choice: watch the firm crumble and hundreds of families lose their livelihoods, or take the fall for a clerical error he hadn't committed. He chose the latter, sacrificing his rising sun to protect the shadows of others. The fall was long and silent. He remembered the feeling of counting copper pennies on a kitchen table that rocked because one leg was shorter than the others, the taste of cheap coffee, and the way his father, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the ink of 1,000 janitorial shifts, had looked at him. His father hadn't been disappointed. He had placed a rough, calloused hand on Marcus's shoulder and told him that a man's worth wasn't found in the height of the skyscraper he designed, but in the strength of the foundation he stood upon when the world tried to knock him down. The loudest person in the room is the weakest, Marcus, his father had whispered. The one who builds in silence is the one who truly owns the ground. While Marcus was learning the bone-deep lessons of sacrifice and quiet dignity, Eleanor Sterling was perfecting a different craft. In those same years, across a different campus, she was already a predator in a pearl necklace. She lived for the social kill. There was a girl back then, a rival for the head of a prestigious sorority, whom Eleanor had dismantled with a single, calculated lie. She had planted stolen exam keys in the girl's locker and watched with a smug, tight-lipped smile as campus security escorted her competition away in tears. Eleanor hadn't just wanted to win, she wanted to erase anyone she deemed beneath her. To Eleanor, life was a ladder, and the only way to climb was to plant her designer heels on the fingers of those below. The memory snapped like a dry twig as the harsh reality of the present rushed back in. Eleanor was still there, her face a mask of ugly, contorted rage, her voice grating like sandpaper against his ears. She was holding her phone up now, the screen glowing as she began a live stream, her tone shifting into that performative, victimized cadence she used for her online followers. "You guys, you won't believe this," she said to the camera, her eyes darting back to Marcus with a look of pure venom. "There is a man here, a worker, and he just reached into my personal space. I don't feel safe in my own driveway. I'm waiting for the police, but honestly, this is what happens when you let just anyone into the gates." Marcus stood by his rusted truck, the grease on his pants and the dirt under his fingernails feeling like a suit of armor rather than a mark of shame. He saw her friend Brenda pulling up in a white SUV, already rolling down her window with a sneer that matched Eleanor's perfectly. Brenda didn't even ask what happened, she just started recording too, her mouth twisted in a silent, judgmental, "Oh." Marcus felt the weight of their combined prejudice, a heavy, suffocating blanket of assumptions. They saw the hood of his sweatshirt and the age of his vehicle and decided they knew his entire life story. They had no idea that the man they were treating like a stray dog was the same man who had spent the last decade rebuilding a billion-dollar empire from the dirt up, brick by silent brick. As the distant wail of a police siren began to echo through the quiet streets of the gilded terrace, Marcus took a slow, deep breath. He thought of his father's hands. He thought of his own hidden strength. The storm was here, but he was the one who had built the house. The sirens grew louder, their rhythmic wails bouncing off the pristine white facades of the neighboring mansions like a physical assault. Eleanor's face lit up with a triumphant, ugly glow as the red and blue lights began to dance across her designer sunglasses. She didn't just point at Marcus anymore, she began to perform. "Oh, thank God you're here," she cried out as a patrol car screeched to a halt at the curb. "Officer, this man right here. He was lurking by my patio, and the moment I turned my back, my custom diamond watch was gone. He's dangerous, and he's refusing to show me what's in his pockets. I want him off my property and in handcuffs, now." The officer, a man named Miller who had enjoyed many a steak dinner at the Sterling estate, didn't even look at Marcus with an ounce of neutrality. He stepped out of the car, his hand resting heavy on his belt, his eyes shielded by dark aviators. "All right, buddy, let's make this easy," Miller said, his voice dripping with a casual, dismissive authority. "Hands behind your back. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Marcus felt the cold, biting metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, the jagged edges digging into his skin. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He simply watched the way Eleanor's friend Brenda continued to film, her phone held high like a weapon, her face twisted into a smug, self-righteous smirk. "It's about time we cleaned up this street," Brenda muttered loud enough for the camera to catch, her eyes rolling toward the sky. Just then, a sleek black sedan pulled up a few yards away, and David, Marcus's loyal assistant, stepped out holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. David stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of his boss being shoved against the rusted side of the work truck. "What is going on?" David shouted, rushing forward. Eleanor stepped in his path, her hand raised like a shield. "Stay back, young man," she hissed, her voice dripping with a fake, motherly concern. "You shouldn't be seen with people like this. He's a thief. I'm doing everyone a favor by getting him out of here before he strikes your place next." David looked at Eleanor as if she were speaking a foreign language, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. A heavy silence fell over the driveway, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower. Marcus looked toward the doorway of Eleanor's mansion and saw a shadow moving behind the screen. It was Julian, Eleanor's 19-year-old son. The boy's face was a mask of sheer terror, his knuckles white as he gripped the doorframe, his eyes darting between his mother's back and the man in handcuffs. He looked like he wanted to scream, but the words seemed to die in his throat. Beside him, tucked away in the shadows of her own porch, Mrs. Gable stood perfectly still, her eyes watering as she witnessed the blatant injustice. No one stood up for Marcus. To the neighbors peering through their blinds, he was just a headline waiting to happen, a cautionary tale about why you don't hire outsiders. Miller shoved Marcus toward the back of the patrol car, the metal door swinging open with a heavy, hollow thud. Eleanor leaned in close, her breath hot and smelling of expensive mints against Marcus's ear. "Did you really think someone like you could just walk into a place like this and not get noticed?" she whispered, her voice a sharp, jagged blade. "You're nothing but trash on a gold-plated sidewalk, and I'm finally taking you out." Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, icy focus that made her flinch for a split second. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a power that shouldn't have belonged to a man in rags. "A mistake that is going to cost you every single thing you think you own." Eleanor let out a sharp, mocking laugh, but as the police car door slammed shut, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that the ground beneath her designer heels had just begun to shift. The heavy thud of the patrol car door echoing through the neighborhood seemed to signal Marcus's final defeat, but the universe had other plans for the Gilded Terrace that afternoon. Just as Officer Miller began to put the vehicle in gear, a sleek, midnight blue sedan rounded the corner, moving with a silent, predatory grace that commanded immediate attention. It didn't belong to the local police, and it certainly didn't belong to any of the neighbors. The car pulled to a sharp halt, blocking the patrol car's path. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her fingers pausing mid-scroll on her phone as she prepared to scold another intruder. But as the driver's side door opened, a man in a charcoal Italian suit stepped out, clutching a leather briefcase with the kind of confidence that only comes from owning the room before you even enter it. "This is a private road," Eleanor began, her voice regaining its shrill, authoritative edge. "We're in the middle of a police investigation, so if you're lost, I suggest you..." She stopped abruptly as the man ignored her entirely, walking straight toward the patrol car. "Officer, my name is Arthur Sterling, Senior Counsel for the Thorn Development Group," the man said, his voice a cool, rhythmic baritone that cut through the humidity. "You're going to want to release the man in the back of that car immediately." Eleanor let out a sharp, mocking bark of a laugh, clutching her throat. "Thorn Development? That's the company that built this entire estate. Why would their lawyers be here for a common thief?" The lawyer turned slowly, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "Mrs. Sterling, I think there has been a profound misunderstanding," Arthur replied, his eyes flicking to the handcuffs visible through the window. "You didn't just call the police on a gardener. You called the police on the man whose family trust owns the very land your house sits on." The air seemed to leave the driveway in a collective gasp. Eleanor's face went from a flushed, angry red to a sickly, translucent white. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Marcus's truck idling nearby. Inside the patrol car, Marcus didn't look like a victim anymore. He sat upright, his eyes fixed on Eleanor through the glass. The shift was internal, a quiet clicking of gears as he moved from the role of the humble laborer to the architect of his own justice. He watched as Officer Miller's hand began to tremble while he fumbled for the keys to the handcuffs. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted entirely. Marcus realized in that moment that his father was right, the foundation was everything. He had spent months in this neighborhood, working in the dirt and enduring the sneers, not because he had to, but because he was testing the structural integrity of the community he had built. And Eleanor had just proven that the whole place was infested with rot. As the handcuffs fell away with a hollow metallic clatter, Marcus stepped out of the car, rubbing his wrists. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an apology. Instead, he walked over to his truck and pointed to a small, discreet lens mounted near the rearview mirror. "You see that, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. "That's a 360-degree high-definition dashcam. It's been recording since the moment I pulled in. It saw exactly where I was standing when you claimed I was on your patio. It saw that your hands were empty when you walked down those stairs. And most importantly, it saw you lie to a peace officer." Eleanor tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Her friend Brenda had already lowered her phone, her thumb hovering nervously over the delete button. The victim persona Eleanor had spent the last hour perfecting was disintegrating in real time. Marcus turned to his lawyer, his expression hardening into something formidable. "Arthur, I want the eviction proceedings for Unit 42 started by the end of the business day. There is a moral conduct clause in the land lease agreement that forbids harassment of employees and contractors on the estate. I think a public arrest based on a false report qualifies, don't you?" Marcus didn't wait for her reaction. He didn't need to see her cry or hear her beg. He had spent his life playing the long game, and the board was finally set. He looked at the mansion, then back at the woman who thought she was its queen. He wasn't the victim anymore, he was the planner. And as he climbed back into his rusted truck, leaving the luxury sedan and the stunned police officer behind, he knew the real work was only just beginning. The Gilded Terrace was about to find out exactly what happens when the foundation decides to stop supporting the house. The following week in the Gilded Terrace was deceptively quiet, like the eerie stillness that precedes a massive tectonic shift. To the world outside, Eleanor Sterling was winning. She spent her afternoons lounging by her infinity pool, clinking glasses of expensive Chardonnay with Brenda and recounting the story of how she had bravely confronted a dangerous trespasser. She felt invincible, the queen of her gated hill, convinced that her status and her lies had successfully scrubbed the trash from her sightline. She even began planning a celebratory gala, a grand affair to reassert her dominance over the neighborhood, blissfully unaware that the man she had tried to destroy was currently presiding over a glass-walled boardroom 40 floors above the city streets. In his corporate headquarters, Marcus Thorne was a different man entirely. The faded hoodie and grease-stained pants were gone, replaced by a bespoke navy suit that fit him like a second skin. He moved with a sharp, calculated precision, his movements reflected in the polished mahogany of his desk. While Eleanor was ordering floral arrangements and silk linens, Marcus was poring over years of law archives and legal records. He wasn't just looking for revenge, he was looking for the truth. His desk was littered with transcripts of complaints Eleanor had filed over the years, vicious, racially charged grievances against delivery drivers, cleaners, and contractors. He saw the pattern of her cruelty, a systematic effort to turn the Gilded Terrace into a fortress of exclusion. Every phone call he made to his legal team, every secret meeting with board members who had long been silenced by Eleanor's bullying, was a brick in the wall he was building around her. The grind was silent, rhythmic, and relentless. Marcus worked late into the nights, the blue light of his monitors illuminating a face that showed no anger, only a deep, unwavering resolve. He wasn't reacting with the hot, messy rage Eleanor expected, he was playing the long game. He met with Mrs. Gable in the dimly lit corner of a quiet park far from the neighborhood. The elderly woman spoke in hushed tones, her voice trembling as she finally confessed what she had seen through her sheer curtains that fateful morning. She described Eleanor's son, Julian, slipping out of the house with a frantic look in his eyes, clutching something small and sparkling before disappearing down the street. Marcus listened intently, taking notes, but he didn't rush to the precinct. He knew that the most effective trap is the one the prey walks into willingly, thinking it's a path to victory. As the days passed, subtle hints began to surface for those who knew where to look. Small, unmarked envelopes were delivered to certain households. Private investigators moved like ghosts through the community, documenting the insurance claims Eleanor had filed over the last decade. Back at the Sterling estate, Julian watched his mother with a growing sense of dread. He saw her arrogance, her laughter, and the way she treated the world like her personal footstool, and the guilt began to eat at him from the inside out. He spent hours staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over Marcus's number, caught between the loyalty of a son and the conscience of a human being. The stage was being set, the actors were in place, and as the night of the gala approached, Marcus Thorne stood by his office window, looking down at the lights of the city. He wasn't just the gardener anymore, he was the architect of a storm that was about to wash the Gilded Terrace clean. The evening of the annual Gilded Terrace Gala arrived with a stifling sense of self-importance. The neighborhood clubhouse had been transformed into a palace of glass and gold, illuminated by thousands of fairy lights that dripped from the ceiling like frozen rain. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of top-shelf champagne. Eleanor Sterling stood at the center of the ballroom, draped in a gown of shimmering silver silk that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary. She swirled her glass, her eyes scanning the room with the predatory satisfaction of a general surveying a conquered territory. Beside her, Brenda was already deep into a second glass, laughing loudly at a joke about property taxes while adjusting her heavy gold bracelets. It was a victory lap for Eleanor, a public celebration of the order she had restored to their sanctuary. The music was a soft, elegant jazz that hummed beneath the chatter of the elite, but the rhythm of the night shifted abruptly when the heavy mahogany double doors at the entrance swung open. A silence began at the back of the room and rippled forward like a cold front. A man stepped into the light, but he wasn't the dusty, hooded figure they remembered. Marcus Thorne stood tall in a midnight blue tuxedo, the fabric catching the light with a subtle, expensive sheen. His posture was commanding, his gaze level and piercing. Beside him, David walked with a newfound confidence, carrying a slim, metallic briefcase. The guests whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting from Marcus to Eleanor, waiting for the explosion. Eleanor's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't even put down her drink as she marched toward him, her high heels clicking like a countdown on the polished marble. "I don't know how you got past the gate, but this is a private event for homeowners and their guests," she snapped, her voice cutting through the jazz like a serrated blade. "You were lucky I didn't press charges last week, but showing up here? That's a level of delusion I didn't think even you were capable of." She looked at the guests, a mocking smirk playing on her lips. "Can someone call security? Our former gardener seems to think he's invited to the ball." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry, he looked bored. He stood his ground as the neighborhood's private security detail approached, but as the guards reached him, they didn't grab his arms. Instead, they stopped, stood at attention, and gave a crisp, respectful nod. Marcus looked past Eleanor, his eyes finding Mrs. Gable, who sat at a nearby table with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and Julian, who stood by the bar looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, the air suddenly too thin for the arrogant laughter that had filled it moments before. Brenda stepped forward, emboldened by the wine, and pointed a finger at Marcus's chest. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here after what you did to Eleanor. We all saw the video. We all know what you are. Why don't you go back to the dirt where you belong?" The crowd murmured in agreement, the collective weight of their judgment pressing down on Marcus. It was the same heat he had felt in the driveway, the same suffocating blanket of prejudice that had tried to bury him 15 years ago. But this time, Marcus wasn't a student with nothing to lose. He was a man who had built the very walls they were standing inside. Marcus finally spoke, and his voice was a low, resonant rumble that demanded every ear in the room. "I'm not here to garden, Eleanor. And I'm certainly not here for the champagne." He stepped closer, his presence so overwhelming that Eleanor actually took a half step back, her silver dress rustling nervously. "You've spent a lot of time talking about who belongs in this neighborhood and who doesn't. You've treated these gates like the borders of your own kingdom. But I think it's time everyone here understands exactly who's been paying for the crown you're wearing." He gestured to David, who opened the briefcase to reveal a series of legal documents and a small remote control. The giant projection screen at the front of the room, intended for a slideshow of the neighborhood's achievements, flickered to life. Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally piercing through her smug exterior. She tried to move toward the screen, to block it with her body, but the silence in the room was now absolute. The trap was set, the guests were gathered, and the architect was ready to reveal the true design of the house Eleanor Sterling had built on a foundation of lies. The projection screen flared to life with a blinding white light that seemed to bleach the color right out of Eleanor's face. The room went so silent you could hear the soft hiss of the bubbles in 100 champagne flutes. Marcus stood perfectly still, his silhouette sharp against the glowing screen, as the first image appeared. It wasn't a picture of a garden or a building, it was high-definition security footage from the Sterling estate, dated the morning of the incident. In the video, Eleanor was clearly visible on her patio, but her wrist was bare. She wasn't wearing the diamond watch she had accused Marcus of stealing. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom like a cold wind. Eleanor's hand began to shake, her silver silk gown shimmering with her tremors. "This is a fabrication," she shrieked, her voice cracking as it hit a desperate, shrill note. "You've doctored this." "Security," I said, "get him out of here." But the security guards didn't move an inch. They remained like stone statues, their eyes fixed on the screen as the video transitioned. The next clip showed the interior of the Sterling living room. Julian, her son, walked into frame. He looked haunted, his eyes darting around the room before he picked up a small, glittering object from a bookshelf hidden behind a vase. He didn't look like a thief, he looked like a boy trying to reclaim something that didn't belong to the person who held it. "I didn't steal it," a voice rang out from the back of the room. Julian stepped forward into the circle of light, his face tear-stained but his jaw set with a sudden, fierce integrity. "Mom, stop it. I took the watch because I knew you were going to use it for another insurance claim. I saw the papers on your desk. I couldn't let you ruin a man's life just to pay off your secret debts." The room erupted into a feverish whispering. Eleanor turned on her son, her eyes bulging with a mixture of betrayal and predatory rage. "Shut up, Julian," she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper that carried to the very back of the hall. "You don't know what you're talking about." Marcus stepped into the center of the floor, his presence expanding until he seemed to dwarf everyone in the room. He didn't need a microphone, his voice was a thunderous authority that commanded the very air. "You're right, Eleanor," he said, his words cold and precise as a surgeon's blade. "He doesn't know the half of it. But I do. Arthur, show them the ledger." The screen changed again, displaying a series of financial documents from the Thorne Development Group. "These are the land lease agreements for every unit in the Gilded Terrace. And this highlighted section right here is the moral conduct clause." Marcus walked toward Eleanor, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the marble. "You see, Eleanor, my father used to clean the floors of buildings just like this one. He was treated like he was invisible, just like you treated me. But he taught me that a person's character is the only currency that matters in the end. You've spent years using your position to bully, harass, and lie. You lied about the theft, you lied to the police, and you've been defrauding your insurance company for years. I didn't come here to be your gardener. I came here to see if the neighborhood I built was being run by a leader or a tyrant." The color had completely drained from Eleanor's lips. She looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, but even Brenda had stepped back, putting several feet of distance between herself and the woman who was now radioactive. Eleanor tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing in a pathetic imitation of her former arrogance. You You can't do this, she stammered, her voice a hollow shell of itself. Do you know who I am? Marcus leaned in, his face inches from hers, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. I know exactly who you are, Eleanor. You're a tenant whose lease has just been terminated for cause. You have 48 hours to vacate the property before the sheriff arrives to remove your belongings. The killing blow wasn't a physical strike, but the sound of two police officers stepping through the double doors at the back of the room. They weren't Miller or his friends, they were detectives from the fraud division. Mrs. Sterling, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of insurance fraud and filing a false police report, the lead detective announced, the metallic jingle of handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom. Eleanor let out a long, low wail of pure despair, her knees finally giving out as she collapsed onto the floor in a heap of expensive silver silk. Marcus didn't look back as they led her away. He stood tall, the architect who had finally cleared the rot from the foundation, as the guests began to realize that the man they had mocked was the only reason they had a roof over their heads. The heavy, double mahogany doors of the clubhouse finally settled into a profound silence as the last of the police cruisers flickered out of the gilded terrace. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from a toxic exclusivity to something sober and reflective. Marcus Thorne stood at the edge of the terrace, his tuxedo jacket removed and draped over one arm, looking out at the neighborhood he had built. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Julian. The boy's eyes were red, the weight of his mother's disgrace hanging heavy on his young frame, but his gaze was clear. I'm sorry, Julian whispered, his voice cracking with the raw honesty of a life changed in an instant. Marcus turned and looked at the young man, seeing not the son of his enemy, but a person who had chosen the difficult path of truth. Marcus offered a firm, grounding nod and told him that the sins of the mother were not the burden of the son, promising him a fresh start at Thorne Development if he was willing to work from the ground up. The weeks that followed were a season of reclamation. The gilded terrace began to breathe again. Brenda and the other members of the old guard had retreated into the shadows of their mansions, their influence stripped away like dead leaves in a storm. Marcus spent his mornings not in a boardroom, but back in the dirt of the memorial garden he had started. He finished it with his own hands, planting rows of white lilies and vibrant blue delphiniums. At the center, he placed a simple stone plaque that read, "For those who built the world in silence." Mrs. Gable would often sit on a nearby bench, watching him work, a soft smile on her face. The neighborhood was no longer a fortress, it was becoming a community where the delivery drivers were greeted with a smile and the workers were seen as neighbors. 5 years passed with the quiet grace of a growing forest. The gilded terrace had been officially renamed the Thorne Commons. The tall, wrought iron gates had been removed, replaced by an open, tree-lined boulevard that welcomed all. Marcus stood on the balcony of his own home, the very house Eleanor had once occupied, watching a new generation of children play on the sprawling lawns. He received a letter that morning from a halfway house across the state. It was from Eleanor. She described the grueling shifts she worked at a roadside diner, the smell of cheap grease that never left her skin, and the way her feet ached at the end of every double shift. She wrote about how she finally understood the weight of the coins she once looked down upon. There was no anger in her words, only a hollow, haunting regret. She was living the life Marcus had once endured, and in that irony, the circle of karma was finally complete. Marcus folded the letter and tucked it away, looking down at his own hands, scarred from labor, yet capable of signing billion-dollar contracts. He realized that true power was never about the size of the house or the sparkle of a diamond watch. It was about the integrity of the soul that inhabited the space. As the sun began to set, casting a long, golden glow over the commons, Marcus felt a deep, resonant peace. He had not just defended his dignity, he had built a legacy where the foundation was made of kindness and the walls were held together by truth. The final lesson was etched into every brick of the neighborhood. Never judge a person by the dirt on their clothes or the hood on their head, for you never know when you are standing in the presence of the person who owns the very ground beneath your feet. Kindness is a seed that grows slowly, but its fruit is the only thing that lasts when the storms of life finally pass.